So good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to present this presentation focusing on complex systems. It's part of the Design Thinking series. And we're going to hop right into it. In terms of the objectives of this particular presentation, I'm really focusing on some introductory basic design concepts. Some you may have already been aware of and heard of, but we're going to do a basic just refresh of a few of them. Then a little bit on systems modeling and some of the mindsets needed for understanding uncertainty, but also complexity. And then a little bit more of a focus on the system leverage points, specifically feedback loops and how we can work with them in a very proactive way. So this particular slide is a paradigm model. And a paradigm model is a frame of reference. And oftentimes it provides a mindset in which the system evolves. It's all the rules, all of the structures, all the process of a system. And so this particular diagram is very helpful to remind us that within a system, within a paradigm, you have both an external and an internal view. Oftentimes we focus on the external view, what is actively occurring in the system, in our worlds, and some of the problems and challenges. And this presentation will focus on the system point of view. However, it's always important to remind ourselves that there is an internal view to a system, to a paradigm model that is important to also understand for longer term transformative change. Now, when we talk about paradigms, especially in today's world, it's very much the concept of post-normal times applies. This concept might be new to you, and it really speaks to more of the present state and the types of changes that are happening. And it speaks to a paradigm where a lot of the old orthodoxies and ways of thinking are kind of dissolving, but there isn't a new paradigm or vision yet. And so we're caught in this in-between state where things are shifting and changing and a lot of things don't make sense. And so that is what we call post-normal times. And so that is very much relevant for a lot of the changes that we're seeing in today's world. Now, post-normal times has three distinct features to it. It is a system that is has a lot of complexity. And when we talk about complexity, we mean lots of different variables interacting in different ways, possibly synergistically creating different types of patterns of behavior. So there's a high degree of complexity, very difficult to understand at a surface level. It requires a different types of approach to really get at understanding the patterns of behavior. And within any complex system, there's a lot of different variables that can interact in different ways. And some of those interactions may create conflicts or contradictions in the system. So as a system has more conflicts and contradictions and that increases, it can lend itself to a fair bit of turbulence in a system. And once you have a system that is increasing in turbulence, then you are moving towards the potentiality of chaos in the system. And in this particular instance, we're talking about chaos more as more in a constructive way, where we're understanding the patterns of behavior in the system and how to work with it. And typically when a system goes into chaos, there's one of two outcomes that can happen, really. Either the chaos itself continue to evolve and it could lead to collapse of the system, or there's an opportunity to intervene and transform the system. So typically when you see a lot of chaos, it's a system that's ripe for change. So just understanding these concepts are quite important when you're dealing with very complex systems that have a lot of turbulence and are quite unstable. And so this slide really speaks to a bit more of the complexity. And as you can see in the visual, some of these complexities, the interrelations are very difficult to understand on the surface level. And it's what we call a nonlinear wicked problem. And so it requires a different type of skill set and lens to understand, to diagnose, to be able to work with it in a constructive way. So some of these approaches to systemic inquiry really focus on understanding the patterns of behavior and specifically what is emerging in the system, whether there's a synergistic behavior, and also identifying different points in the system that we call leverage points that are opportunities to change or influence the system in different ways. And so that could lead to new opportunities to restructure parts of the system and opportunities for systemic design. So having this type of skill set and lens to understand is critical in order to influence change. This particular presentation, we're going to focus on one particular leverage point within the system, the feedback loop. Now, there are many different leverage points, a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation. But the reason I'm focusing on the feedback loop is simply because it's a very dynamic part of the system. It's part of the system where you're seeing feedback from a type of behavior and you're seeing a response in the system. And so it's part of the regulation and control of systems. And so typically, those that are new to systems thinking can easily identify those types of patterns of behavior in a system because they are quite dynamic and they might be part of some of the issues or conflicts you're dealing with in your day-to-day work. So this is a very good starting point to be able to identify these feedback loops and then to understand them in terms of what is the pattern of behavior, whether that pattern is increasing or is it's diminishing, and whether this is the type of loop that is virtuous, meaning it's growing in a direction that we're happy with and that will lead to the outcome we want, or if it's more of a vicious cycle where it's increasing and growing in a direction that could be even more problematic and create more turbulence in the system. So again, it's a great starting point to be able to understand the patterns of behavior and start to ask different questions around understanding the complex system. So when we bring this together with system modeling in a very post-normal type of world where there's complexity, contradictions, and potential for chaos, the feedback loop becomes very important. What's also important is understanding uncertainty. So uncertainty typically is something that most people do not feel comfortable with. They tend to gravitate to what they know, or they look for certainty. However, uncertainty is always around. There is no guarantee. And as part of a dynamic, very complex system, there is a fair bit of uncertainty. There are things that we will not understand how certain variables might come together and interact and create different patterns of behavior or different actions. Most of us are very familiar with the concept of a black swan, the unknown unknown. But there are other types of uncertainty in a system that are really important to understand and to work with in a very constructive way. One is what we call the black elephant. And it's something that we know exists, but we don't feel comfortable to talk about it, where there's an embarrassment. So it becomes a managed unknown. And it's an uncertainty at a surface level that we carry into the future because we choose not to address it. And those particular issues, those black elephant issues, they potentially could be tipping points if something erupts and it becomes problematic. But there's also an opportunity to confront it directly. And that's important to be able to really ensure some stability within the system. One of the other interesting metaphors in the post-normal times trilogy of the black swan, black elephant is the black jellyfish. And that's a new concept for many people who are not familiar with post-normal times. But this particular metaphor is quite fascinating because it really speaks to the things that we know about in the system. things that we know are happening, but perhaps they are managed at a very small level. But there's a potentiality that it can escalate and cause a lot of instability. And it's the speed at which it escalates that is very dramatic and can be very problematic. And it can be a paradigm shifting type of situation. And so this becomes a very important metaphor to understand, because it's all about the feedback loop and understanding that dynamic loop and that pattern of behavior. And as we look at the black jellyfish, when something that we know escalates rapidly in a system, it creates a lot of deep uncertainty and it creates a lot of instability. And that positive feedback that's coming from those actions in the system create the instability that is quite powerful. And oftentimes it's underestimated, the power. And oftentimes what's needed is an understanding of the pattern of behavior, understanding that pattern of that loop, and the root issues that are beneath it in order to balance it. So it requires a mindset of being able to step back and look at it with a level of presence and understanding, seeking to understand just how it's the pattern of behavior and how it's evolving. It requires a mindset and it requires a skill set that is not reactive, but it's more inquiry and very curious, seeking to understand and seeking for opportunities to influence and shift the system. And what's really interesting is when we think about it in the context of today's world and the pandemic, many professionals in the future space have spoken about, the pandemic as a black jellyfish event, where it's something that we were aware of, but it was contained, it was managed, and then it escalated very quickly and very rapidly in the system and created a lot of instability across the world. And so those are the features of what we call a black jellyfish. So when we get into understanding post-normal risk, it's really important to understand these 4 components: system complexity and being able to work with it in a very constructive way, understanding the interconnectedness of the system that you are exploring, those conflicts and contradictions that are creating a lot of turbulence in the system, and then identifying the positive feedback loops, knowing how to work with it, including leverage points, in order to influence in the behavior of the system. So the process for post-normal modeling, it really focuses on 3 main areas. It's important to be able to take some of the content around your conflicts and contradictions in the system and being able to map it in a way so you can understand the pattern. And so this can be done very more of an initial mapping to understand and clarify the boundary, understanding some of the issues that are kind of connected to those conflicts or contradictions. But it's an initial system map, really to understand the landscape. Once you're able to have that initial map, then you can go a little bit deeper into understanding patterns and perhaps focusing on specific parts of the system, so zooming in, and then really looking at the patterns that are happening in that system and what that looks like, whether it's a vicious loop or a virtuous loop with your feedbacks that you're getting, whether there's a potential for it to shift direction, the system, towards collapse or stability, or if there's cascading risks that can create further turbulence. So these are some of the features that you're looking for. And the whole intent behind this is being able to understand the patterns, to diagnose them, and then it offers insights and opportunities, right? To be able to think about ways to slow the growth down or balance the system towards more stability. This slide is just a visual example of what a system map can look like. In this particular example, this was based on some of the conflicts in the planning hierarchy. and moving towards from a very fragmented system to a more integrated system. And so it was just taking out some of the conflicts and mapping out that narrative of where we are, where we're moving to, and what are some of the issues in between. So this is a really great starting point as a system map to be able to understand the boundaries of the space that you're exploring. And then you can select an area within the map to do a deeper dive and to understand a pattern that could potentially scale and create turbulence. And so when we look at turbulence, this is an opportunity to really take a deeper look at your feedback loop. And this particular slide it's showing system dynamics with one loop, the R1 being a reinforcing loop, and the B1 being a balancing loop. And what you see here is that it's a model to be able to plug in where you could identify what is that growing action that's creating turbulence in your system, and then what is that impact of that action on your system. So understanding that loop is helpful. And then the other part of it is understanding the balancing action. So what's needed to balance the impacts? And how can you feed that back into the system? So that gives you kind of a sense of both sides of the reinforcing and the balancing. But what's really interesting too is that connected to this, as I mentioned earlier, there's leverage points. So as you're looking at your reinforcing loop, you can identify or start to take a step back and ask yourself, is there an opportunity to slow down the growth of this reinforcing loop? What's contributing to its growth? And so it requires you to take a deeper look at it and ask these questions. On the other side, for the balancing, there's an opportunity to ask a question with respect to how do you balance and strengthen the loop with respect to that impact, right? And again, it can be very much a point of inquiry that generates ideas that could be very helpful from a design process. So understanding this dynamic is quite helpful, and understanding where the system is moving, whether it's moving in the direction towards balance or it's rapidly going in the direction towards turbulence. And so having a sense of which direction really allows you to prioritize where you're going to focus your attention and perhaps your action for design. And of course, if something is moving at a rapid pace in terms of turbulence within a system that potentially could lead to chaos, then there is an opportunity to explore what it could potentially look like if the system were to collapse. How would you anticipate that could happen? And what new opportunities could emerge? So perhaps parts of the system may collapse, but it may give way to a transformation. So these are also different questions you can ask to think more in anticipatory lens moving towards the future. And of course, anytime you're looking at system dynamics and you do want to balance the system towards stability, it's important to consider what are the limiting factors towards your balancing action, because there might be some limitations in terms of what's in your scope or what's in your realm to be able to take action. But again, it might highlight some new opportunities, perhaps new collaborations, new partnerships, new ways of thinking about balancing that are unfamiliar to perhaps the individual, but it might lead to a new way of working with other system stakeholders. In summary, understanding system dynamics and asking different questions, systemic inquiry into different parts really helps to understand. It helps to understand the behavior, to diagnose what's happening. And it helps us to uncover some questions that prompts action for potential design. So it's very helpful, and it's it's one way to be able to take a very close look at elements within a complex system. So this is very much a zoomed in lens of a bigger system. So to summarize some of the details of this presentation, when you're looking to map turbulent systems, it's really valuable to understand the conflicts and contradictions in the system, because that's what's creating a lot of the turbulence. And that turbulence, those feedback loops, are a little bit easier to identify within a system. So that's a great starting point to really take a deeper dive into some of the patterns. And understanding how to use leverage points for inquiry to gain deeper insights is invaluable. And if you start at that leverage point, you can also then work with other leverage points in the system to really look at different ways to evolve the system structure. So that's really, that's a little bit beyond this presentation, but this particular feedback leverage point is a very helpful entry point to a broader lens of system leverage points that are invaluable. And remembering that the insights generated from design methodology can really help to understand the problem space and to frame it. And by taking a lens and framing some of the specific areas that require attention, it allows an opportunity to take a deeper dive and to design opportunities for solutions. So thank you very much for your attention, your time with this presentation. If you have any questions on any of the information that I've covered, please feel free to contact me by email. I would love to receive your questions and your comments.